Hey there, this is Tom with the Diogenes Lamp podcast. I appreciate you listening in, and most importantly, I hope you enjoy what you hear. Before we start with today's episode, I'm going to ask you for a small favor. Believe it or not, history podcasts, especially in their early stages, tend not to be cash cows. Shocker, I know. I too was blindsided by this news. Now, I didn't go into this for the money, I think that much is obvious. But unfortunately, books, research materials, and equipment aren't free. Please, go to patreon.com/Diogenes Lamp Podcast, and for less than the price of a coffee once a month, you can become a member and get access to bonus episodes, recommended reading lists and documentaries, shout-outs, and anything else we'll offer in the future as this project grows. If you are especially broke, hey, I get it, but please, make sure to give us a 5-star review when you listen to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and subscribe to the pod on your preferred podcast listening medium. Your support is appreciated, and more importantly, it is needed in order to keep this operation going. On that note, I hope you have a great day, and now back to the show. Hey everyone. For today's episode, I was able to bring to the pod Dr. Dale Pappas, who is an author and educator based in Miami, Florida, and teaches at universities in Athens and Berlin. Dr. Pappas holds a PhD in modern European history from the University of Miami and has researched the history of tourism in the Mediterranean, the political history of modern Greece, and several other topics. We'll be talking specifically about the Noemvriana, a small, often overlooked event in modern Greek history that we've mostly just skimmed over thus far, but that was nonetheless very impactful. We talk about the national schism, the crossroads Greece was at in 1916, the realities of Greek expansion, and how all of this is about more than just a disagreement between Venizelos and the king. I hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I did, and now on to the show. So, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me and give this opportunity to our listeners as well. How I
Oh, thank
came across actually your article, and for our listeners that don't know, I was doing research for the Noemvriana episode. And I was doing research and I came across your article, Dr. Pappas, The Strange Story of How Greece Joined the Entente in World War One, which is, in a nutshell, about the Noemvriana. What I want to get into, or what I want to start off with anyways, is just about the Noemvriana, how it's covered in general, and more specifically, like how it's remembered or like how it's not remembered, if that makes sense, you know?
right, right. Well, thanks for having me, Tom. And you're right. The Noemvriana is not the most remembered instance of political conflict in modern Greece because it's been overshadowed by what came after, especially the Greek Civil War in the 1940s and even the military dictatorship in the 1960s and early 1970s. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not an insignificant event, not just in the history of modern Greece, but also the history of Europe and also the history of World War One, which is actually where I was inspired to write this article. So that might come as a bit of a surprise to listeners who have probably at least heard of this event, whether we call it the Noemvriana, the November events, the Battle of Athens in late 1916, right? Whatever the case might be, we might be familiar with this from the standpoint of modern Greek history. And really, most historians focus on this event from that standpoint, and especially from the standpoint of political conflict in modern Greece. So sort of categorizing it in the same way that we would look at the Greek Civil War and other political uh, conflicts in modern Greek history. But it is actually also a very important event in the history of World War One,
Yeah.
which is sort of where the article was going.
Let's talk a little more about the broader backdrop of the Noemvriana, which is, as you were saying, World War One. Where does Greece stand in the broader context of World War One, of that conflict specifically? Is it a liability? Is it a belligerent? What is Greece in all this?
Yeah, so Greece, of course, is out of World War One when this conflict begins in the summer of 1914. Greece is basically considered one of the smaller powers in Europe that are on the sidelines at that point, but that the actors, the two main warring sides, the Entente and the Central Powers, are looking to bring on or to engage with in some way. And so gradually over the course of 1915, late 1914, 1915, 1916, 1917, countries that are on the sidelines mostly gradually enter into this conflict on one side or the other. And Greece's position is one that might be kind of unusual to observers at first, because, of course, if we think about modern Greek history, we know that countries like Britain, France, and Russia are typically at the forefront of Greece's relations
Right.
and kind of close ties over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. And so it might be kind of surprising to people who aren't so familiar with this topic to say, well, why doesn't Greece just join Britain, France, and Russia in 1914 or
Right.
1915?
I mean, sorry to cut you off, but these are powers that literally helped create the modern Greek, battle in the outer ring.
Exactly,
Everyone knows this.
exactly.
Seems like a no-brainer almost, right?
Right, right. And then, of course, we also have to take into consideration the German legacy with Greece, with different German states, of course, going from Bavaria at first to Greece's close ties with the German Empire once that is established in the 1860s and 1870s. Germany becomes a major economic player by the early 20th century in in the Greek economy, a major trade partner, and of course Greece's royal family is very close to the German royal family with this especially Prussian connection, which also happened to be the ruling dynasty of Imperial Germany. So, so that is one reason why Greece is somewhat torn at first, because the Greek monarchy has this familial tie to everyone involved, but especially to that German royal family. And
Right.
also, the other component of that is that a lot of, especially upper class Greeks, the sort of pseudo aristocracy of the country, especially in the military class, but also in the world of business, had very close ties to Germany and to Austria Hungary, and had spent perhaps their education in those countries, and in general admired the culture and the industries of those countries. So, so Greeks were sort of torn between these two camps, depending perhaps to some extent on their politics as well, or some other component of their backgrounds. But Greece is rather split uh, between these two camps.
Yeah. And I mean, my listeners, or the listeners already know this because, they've been listening to the podcast. They know King Constantine's brother-in-law, the Kaiser. We know Metaxas. The Germanophile charge is often thrown against him. Whether that's fair or not is a different debate. But he was educated in Berlin. There were other, I think Venizelos' foreign minister, George Strait, was another guy who had German connections. Like you're saying, there is a lot of German connections. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Another, from what I've read, anyways, Beaton goes into, and I think your article touches on it perhaps a little bit as well. But another big reason why Greece couldn't just be, anyways, a belligerent around the side of the Central Powers outright is because the British have a navy, and Greece is a country of islands.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's kind of the most obvious example is that we have to sort of separate the reality from what may be the desires of some people, especially the desires of the royalists, the people most closely connected to the monarchy and to the royal family itself. Maybe, if all things considered, the situation were different, perhaps they would have sided with Germany, or at least have been pretty favorable to them throughout the war. But there was a very clear understanding from a strategic standpoint and from a geopolitical standpoint that Greece could not challenge the Royal Navy, and no Central Power had the kind of navy to contest the British and the French in the Mediterranean. So there would be no help for Greece. Now, the other sort of consideration there as well that really didn't make sense was the question of what would Greece get out of joining this war? What
Ah, good
if we're
point.
if we're thinking about territorial acquisition? Greece was in a rather similar situation to Italy, that was also at first on the sidelines of the First World War and then would join the Entente side as well in 1915, in the sense that the territory that would have been on the wish list for the Italians as well as the Greeks stood with the Central Powers at that time. And so, what would be gained if Greece were to join with the Central Powers, other than maybe perhaps a very powerful Germany allowing Greece to get certain territory from another Central Power like the Ottoman Empire or Bulgaria? But that would have likely also involved Greece giving up some territory, perhaps in exchange to one of those powers. So no one would have known what the situation would have been like. And of course, not that this is directly connected, but we have also seen examples of this later on in World War II when the Germans forced some of their minor Balkan Axis partners to exchange territories. And there was a bit of unfair, in terms of proportion, exchanges of land at the basically insistence of the much stronger Germany. So
Right.
if we
Right.
say anything, we could say it's rather realistic that Greece would have potentially been in that situation in the first place. But then also in say 1914 or 1915, Greece is also hamstrung by the fact that Russia is part of the Entente and that Russia's territorial interests as well would clash with Greece in the Eastern Mediterranean region. That's to say nothing of the fact that Greece and Britain also had disputes about Cyprus, about the future of Cyprus. And of course, the British would then use this as a sort of carrot to incentivize Greece to join, that they would be willing to give up Cyprus. But of course, by that point too, Italy's in the war. Italy controls the Vacanisa or Dodecanese islands that also have a majority Greek speaking, Greek Orthodox population that Greece would
Mhm.
like to acquire too. So the alliance systems get really messy at this point, which is one of the reasons why many Greeks say, well, let's just stay out of this conflict. Why join?
Right. That is, you know, you said it. I was thinking the same thing. It mirrors the similar debacle that Metaxas had. He stated in his memoirs often, and again, we talked about this in episodes. I want to be with the British because it interests us, right? The British, like you said, had Cyprus and whatnot, anyways. Let's get more into the carrots, though. Carrots that the Entente may be able to give Greece. We talked about Cyprus. Are there any other major, I mean, obviously also as well, Asia Minor's in play as well. I mean, in play, but it's being offered a bit as concessions, the type of carrot, right?
Right, right. And this would sort of change as the war progressed and as Russia's situation changed as well. Uh, Once the imperial government falls, there's also a bit of an opening for Greece with the potential for the Ottoman Empire being defeated and a Russian ally not necessarily being able to stake as extensive a claim to that region anymore in relation to, say, the British and the French.
Right.
So there is the opportunity to pursue really the most ambitious and expansionist version of Greek nationalism, and that was wholeheartedly embraced by Venizelos, and really from the onset used by him as this powerful bargaining chip to say, if Greece joins and we're on the winning side, we're going to get this. Like, trust me,
Right.
I will make sure that this happens. And he had a point, even before the situation with Russia changed, that his personal ties and his stature, his brand, if we're using kind of a very modern understanding of it, he was very well situated as far as powerful British and French diplomats and officials were concerned. Venizelos was highly regarded by many in decision making positions in the Entente. And so it was not an unrealistic idea that Venizelos could actually achieve a lot of what he was saying to the Greek population, and therefore build on the gains that he had also helped oversee in the Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913.
Yeah. To keep the momentum going, let's say.
Right.
You could say, I guess, right?
Right, but also the flip side then is that that's ignoring the reality of the time in Greece, that Greece had been at war for basically a decade
Yeah, that's
at this point, and had had political strife in the middle, major economic issues, of course. So, yes, this might sound intriguing to a lot of people or even exciting to people, but then if we're really kind of taking a step back and saying, is this going to happen? We've been through so much already. Can this really happen? And that, of course, is the royalist counter argument saying, I don't know if you want to believe this. This sounds like great talk, but can we achieve it? What is realistic? So
right.
a great deal of this conflict is politics in that sense of saying, is this the kind of politics of the possible? Is this a reality check for people? So it's not necessarily a purely ideological question, as it's often presented, which it's certainly true. There are major ideological clashes and divisions between the different political groups in Greece that go beyond just whether or not we should join World War One. But this is also a major part of this actual decision of whether Greece can be neutral or join the conflict.
Right, right. And I guess we could get into I feel like you could take that and then steer into another direction of just solely talking about the national schism, right? And the debate of is it really I mean, I guess correct me if I'm wrong, but it starts off as this conflict, like you're saying, this a division of idea of what path to take when in relation to World War One. But obviously, I mean, this is something that carries on for decades,
Right,
arguably until the 1974 referendum.
right,
Again, maybe another time we'll have you on to talk about
right.
a national
Yeah,
schism because
it
there's a
is
lot
a
to unpack
yes,
that.
it is a major topic in and of itself, but it's certainly part of this, a huge part of the story. And generally, if we're looking at, say, the World War One story, that might be what's mentioned most in the general histories
Yeah,
as a reference to this clash between Venizelos on one side and the king and his closest
exactly.
advisors on the other side, and that is for shorthand known as the National Schism. But as you're pointing out, it's much deeper than that as well, if we're interested in it from a purely sort of Greek history standpoint.
Right. But you're 100% right. That is how that's kind of how the history is overlooked. You read anything and it goes, World War One happened, the national schism started. And it's only framed as this framework of, it's only boxed in as it was a disagreement of decision making between what side to take in World War One. And it's always boxed in that little sphere. And it's the segment I'm supposed to be running is the Greek Civil War. It's turned into a whole lot of other stuff. We will get to the Greek Civil War for my eventually, but I mean that plays a major part in it as well. The question of the Constitution and the monarchy in the Constitution. So I guess would it be fair to say? Let me ask you this: would it be fair to say that this is where it starts? You know what I mean? Or the defining point of where it started, anyways. There may have been rumblings before, but
Right. I think that that's a good question. If we're talking about where does this kind of political conflict begin in Greece, these rapid or these drastic ideological splits that polarize people from all segments of society and that persist for decades and get folded into other major conflicts, whether we're talking about the world wars or whether we're talking about the Cold War. Uh, that's true, I think, in one sense, but it's also fair to say that these kinds of, I guess, to borrow the political science term, these kind of political cleavages have existed, and many scholars are pointing out that this goes back to the revolution. That this is something that has always been a part of Greek politics. That there have been these opposing camps. They've kind of forced people to choose sides. The names and the people might change, but and even some of the ideas that are a part of that are embraced by one group or another. But this kind of political polarization is not foreign in the modern Greek story. It just takes on different characteristics, and perhaps the best argument in support of that is the idea of the charismatic leader.
Yeah.
uh, Greek politics, for the most part, is sort of distilled into that idea that we don't really have political parties with established platforms as much as we have people, and people will follow that leader, and just sort of take on whatever their political stripes are in that moment. That people back the idea of that popular figure that they admire more than they follow a certain ideology. It's really not until we start getting the rise of that kind of communist politics that begins to change a little bit as far as who is the leader that someone would follow more so than an idea that people would embrace. So in that sense, Venizelos, of course, is one of the most famous examples of the charismatic leader that people would follow, no matter his politics, no matter his platform, and indeed his platform changes over and over again in the course of his political career, and that was by design. And so his role is not that different from, say, other political leaders in modern Greek history, whether we talk about any of the Papandreous in a more modern sense or Karmali. That this has been a present story in Greek politics. It's just that in this instance, the national schism and this World War One story, it's so intense in this few-year period that's why it kind of gets this chapter in modern Greek history.
Do you think that, and again, this is a little bit of a side, but not too much, but do you think that because of what was at stake or what the possibility of what could be gained brought extra emphasis to this political cleavage? You know what I'm saying? And of course, I'm alluding to Asia Minor, Constantinople, of course, right?
Right. I
Perhaps.
mean, right. I mean, I mean, obviously, people couldn't have foreseen exactly not
Right.
just the defeat and the disaster of the military campaign in Anatolia in the 20s, but people could certainly, I think, project the possibilities, like you're saying, of what might happen to this Greek state if certain territories could be added. But there were also people, of course, largely from the royalist side at that point, saying we also have to consider what this would mean for us. It's not necessarily a major net gain for Greece, and that's, I think, what many scholars are talking about in hindsight now. That the idea of Greece even acquiring a foothold in Anatolia, let alone extensive territory, would not have been very realistic for any
Right.
number of reasons. On the one hand, starting with the same premise of why Greece couldn't join Germany if the Greek government had wanted to, what to do about the naval situation. The Greek navy was never going to be able to become the most powerful, dominant force in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so, by acquiring even more territory that would be coastal in nature for part of that, you automatically weaken your position from a naval
Right.
standpoint. So that alone is an issue. That's to say nothing of the fact that you would then be taking over an extensive hinterland in Anatolia where most people would not necessarily support your government or want to identify.
Right.
So you know, you even kind of can separate that and say already there's problems to be had with that idea. So So again, that kind of goes back to that idea of what's the reality check versus what would be on our wish list, what would be something that would achieve a certain political vision.
Right. And, it's funny, you brought it up about kind of like, I mean, I don't want to frame it as saner voices, or, speaking, but, you had people like Metaxas who, was offered the position when the royalists were in charge to be in charge of the military and whatnot, and came out pretty bluntly and said, it's not viable.
Right,
And no matter what we think, and again, we talked about this in past episodes, however we may view them, that they don't have a national consciousness. Clearly they do,
mm,
the Turks. And, even these regions that we're occupying, they're not majority Greek in many cases. There's the geography simply is not, anyways, I don't want to get into it
right,
because that's a whole nother
right,
thing to do. But there were some, as you're alluding to, saner people trying to, you know, what's pragmatic, what's practical, and what's realistic, as you're saying, right?
right. And if we say the cooler heads, so to speak, there are saying these things, or at least in hindsight, we can say that would be correct.
Hindsight. Right, right.
It's important to note too, just as a disclaimer there, this story is different in 1919, 1920. There are
Mm,
plenty of royalists going all the way up to the top who would have been so against this kind of campaign just a few years earlier, who were among the most full-throated supporters at the
yeah, it's
time
very
of that
fluid.
conflict. Right,
Like when the royalists get in charge, it's not like they drop everything. In
right,
fact, if I understand, they even go on even more. I mean,
yes,
under the royalists, they get all the way 60 kilometers just
yeah,
west of Ankara or
yeah,
whatever, right?
yeah.
At
I mean,
Sakaria.
right, right. So it's not to say that, oh, because they're ideologically wedded to this idea that we can't expand, and we certainly can't expand in this direction. That's not true. They embrace that political direction as well once they are in power and the situation looks different, uh, for for reasons that go beyond what we're talking about today.
Political
But
expediency, you could
right,
say, right?
right,
That's interesting. That's a really good point. Well, let's get back to the Noemvriana because again, another time we'll get into that because that's just a whole nother great topic. So, in the meantime, the Entente is giving Greece, carrots. And pretty much the carrots are not working. And this is even in the lead up even to World War One. There's some things going on and whatnot, negotiations or whatever the case between Venizelos. World War One breaks out in 1914. Austro-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Later on in August, more players come in: Germany, France, Britain, Russia. Um, as we get into the summer of 1915, the national divide, the ethnico-sismos, really starts to ramp up. What's actually happening inside Greek Parliament and whatnot? What's like the, I guess, the political map? You know what I'm saying? If
right,
that makes sense.
right. Well, I mean, for shorthand, there's a major stalemate in Parliament as the war progresses and as there's these different um, decisions to be made about whether Greece can join and on which terms. So Greece is basically in a stalemate from a parliamentary standpoint. So one side does not have the ability to unilaterally take the country into war, um, no matter what they want from the Entente or from the Central Powers standpoint. And of course, in 1915 alone, Venizelos is forced to resign twice. It's a
Eek.
very messy situation, and I know that we're talking a lot about the carrots that were sort of put out there by the Entente to sort of try to coax Greece into participating on their side. But of course, then by really this point in 1915, the story sort of flips that uh, we get into a situation where Greece is basically no longer in control of its own ability to decide what it can do to resist or join the Entente or the Central Powers. Because what's lesser, I feel like what's discussed less than this part of the story about what do Britain and France especially want to see from Greece, and what does Venizelos want to kind of get out of the situation by allowing the Entente to land in Macedonia, to set up a front in Thessaloniki once Bulgaria is in the war. Um, that's the more famous part of this story. I think what's lesser known is the fact that the Central Powers also take a more aggressive stance towards Greece in those months leading up to the conflict. They start to put pressure on the Greek government to say, well, if you allow, even if the king doesn't support the idea of this Entente army being in Thessaloniki, Greece is allowing this to happen on their territory. And so, therefore, if this happens, then the Central Powers should be allowed to respond to
Can
this.
you speak a little more, like, just for the listeners? Like, I understand what you're getting at, of course, but what actually happens that pisses off the Central
Right,
Powers? Like, what's happening on the Eastern Front?
right,
What's happening up in Thessalonica, the border of Bulgaria, Fort
right.
Rupel, all that stuff?
Right. I mean, and I guess the starting point to this is saying, well, once there is this very clear cut political freeze, really, where nothing is getting done, the Venizelos and his supporters break away, of course, and set up in Thessaloniki their own provisional government
Right.
and what they call Ethnikiamena, the national defense. And even before this formally happens, the split is becoming more apparent once it's clear that no party in Athens in parliament is able to really govern. And there's this gridlock. So this is coming, that there is some sort of movement that Venizelos is going to basically take his supporters away and just rival the king and know that we're going to put this up against the external situation and we're going to lay our cards down and see what happens at the end of the day. We're going to play the situation of what's going on in this war, and we're going to find out what's going to happen to Greece, basically, in the First
Kind of
World
go
War.
toe to toe and
Right,
really almost like play chicken,
right,
if you will.
right. Venizelos was not
Mm.
afraid to do something
Yeah.
of
He
this
was a risk
nature.
taker. I feel
Yeah.
like that's a big legacy as a gambler and a risk taker with
Yes.
Venice. I mean, some of it
Yes.
obviously paid off a lot, but
Yeah. I mean,
uh,
born revolutionary, to
yeah,
say the least. Never kind of lost that conspiratorial nature. Never afraid to take a kind of risk like that.
from his
There,
time in Crete, yeah,
right. There's a
early days where he really got his political name as a
right,
Thaddeus revolt and all that jazz. Yeah,
right. There's a
really cool.
very famous line that he says to I think the British vice consul in Thessaloniki, where he says, something to the effect of, "Here I am in rebellion again," sort of where I'm most,
That's awesome.
where I'm most comfortable is sort of
Where I'm
being a
most
rebel.
comfortable. Oh my God,
You
that's
know,
great. That's a
so
great line.
yeah,
What a
so
guy.
yeah, so even in the midst of holding the reins of power in the country, he's also more than happy to take this kind of step. And so then, of course, with this political deadlock, you have now the makings of two separate governments. No one really knowing who's calling the shots in Greece, right? Is Greece being governed from Athens? Is Greece being governed by Thessaloniki? So both sides are weighing their options here as far as the warring camps here, the Entente and the Central Powers. What's going on in Greece, and what can we do to affect some kind of change in this situation? And so as the Entente now starts to tighten the screws a little bit on the royalist government in Athens, now knowing that they have a friendly voice who's gathering support in Thessaloniki. At the same time, the Central Powers see this and begin to tighten the screws on the royalist government to say, you've got to declare your intentions now. You,
Oh
you're
wow.
you're first of all letting your prime minister or your former prime minister lead this like rogue state, basically, in effect, in your second biggest city, and you're also talking to the Entente, and we know what they have in their back pocket. We know that they have this naval presence in the region. We know that they can put pressure to bear on you. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to put pressure to bear. And I feel like it's a little lesser known to people that the Germans and Bulgarians come into northern Greece and occupy several strategic outposts, especially the Rupel.
They get
Uh,
all the way to Kavala, if I'm not
mhm.
mistaken.
Yes,
Pretty far deep
yes,
to
yes.
Greece.
So kind of at the request of the, or kind of at the acceptance of the royalist government, people, of
Right.
course, we really don't know all of these details, all of the kind of machinations. There's a lot of stories going one way or the other about to what extent was the king not just supportive of this, but actually encouraging this invasion to sort of set up the stakes here. Okay, what's going to happen? How are the Entente going to respond to
Hmm.
this now? What can we do? So we really don't know, but we know that that's the outcome. That now there's a situation where you've got the Central Powers occupying strategic positions in Greece. You've got the Entente occupying strategic positions in Greece, and the Greek government making no formal declarations one way or the other. And oh, by the way, they have a rogue government, essentially the separate state being
Gee.
developed that is so opposed to them, basically now, no matter what the outcome might be. So this is a situation where the Greek state now has really no sovereignty to act in this situation. What can they really do?
It's not.
They're now not driving the story; they are being acted upon. They've sort of lost all agency, or so it appears at this point, leading up to what happens in late 1916.
No more carrots, let's say.
Yeah,
The stakes have come out.
yeah,
Wow. So, I mean, I understand, yeah. And so, to my understanding, then at some point, in like 1915 or was it 1916 or so, Entente forces land formally in what's considered at this point the new lands. This is like a name or a divide that
mhm,
emerges. New lands, which is ruled by Venizelos, kind of like, correct me if I'm wrong, but the lands essentially that were acquired by Venizelos during the Balkan Wars, is that kind of
yes,
the, okay. And then the old lands, kind of like the first Greek state,
hmm,
like around Athens, Nafplio,
right,
Peloponneso, kind of the
right,
first revolution, pre-Balkan Wars state, we could
right,
say. That's
right.
interesting that, that divide, because we say national schism, it's a constitutional issue, but it also takes on this dimension, a geographical dimension as
Yes,
well now, which is
yes,
interesting.
absolutely, and it's true. And another point to make about that is that the definition of what's new and old shifts over time because Greece, of course, in its history is expanding, and they do gain territories at different points, and some of those earlier territorial acquisitions, especially the Ionian Islands, become part of the old Greek network, even though they were not at first part of the modern Greek state that was created. They become more politically aligned with the mainland, with the southern mainland, especially in the royalist and more conservative politics, and become really dismissive and hostile, especially to Venizelos and his supporters. So there is that divide, new and old. Over time, it takes on different forms, but certainly in this moment, that is our situation where you have the new lands, largely northern Greece today, and the old Greece being skeptical of what these newcomers and who favor Venizelos so much have to say. So
That's
yeah, we're
interesting.
definitely at that point.
I mean, yeah, and there seems to be a lot. I mean, when I was just doing the reading and research into this whole event, I mean, I don't know if you wouldn't call. I mean, we know later on, and the listeners do because again, we already covered this in previous episodes. But just like you said, right? Like the old lands, new lands will shift after all of this when the Asia Minor campaign is taking place. That's the new lands, right? Right.
Right.
That's the and then the old Greece becomes the borders that were established post World War One and whatnot. I mean, have you ever heard? Let's talk a bit about anti-Venizelism, and then we'll get into actual Noemvriana. So, I mean, this force of anti-Venizelism as a political force, it manifests itself chiefly in monarchism. What are all I could ever gather, and just totally, I might be totally wrong on this, but from what I gathered, it seems like it's just chiefly wasn't really anything else aside from just being anti-Venizelos and
That that
conservatism, maybe in general.
that's a good point. That Venizelos, going back to the idea of the charismatic leader, and whether you love or you hate,
Hate them.
quite clearly the charismatic leader, a lot of anti-Venizelism is largely manifested in the resentment of Venizelos. In part, that was by design. Again, going back to Venizelos's politics, as many biographers of his point out, he was not someone who was wedded in any form to a certain kind of ideology. I mean, loosely kind of traditional European liberalism in the 19th century understanding of the term. Yeah, okay, at first he does largely subscribe to this, but he's basically willing to flirt with anything that will keep him in power in
Right.
that moment.
As
And
we see in
so,
33 and 35 with,
right,
with Bastidas and Venizelos later on.
exactly.
And
Exactly, exactly. So because of this, a lot of the opposition to him is largely personal, thinking this guy's just a populist, nationalist. He's going and catering to basically in this case, especially to the kind of lowest classes of people, as royalists would see for the most part, saying he's just duping people, basically, just kind of getting them to do whatever he wants. And so, of course, both parts of that were guilty of the same thing and playing politics, trying to get certain bases to back them. But you're right that anti-Venezelism, even though of course we largely associate it with people who were royalist sympathizers or who actually admired the royal family or the king, but it was bigger than that too. I mean, and in fact, a lot of the anti-Venezelist politicians who rise to power against him were themselves not necessarily particularly devoted monarchists or particularly devoted to the king personally in that moment. So it was indeed more so just a kind of resentment of the personality and the way that Venizelos himself conducted his affairs and led the country. So that was a huge part of this equation. Of course, also connected to these ideas of the time, like we've been talking about, whether it was really realistic that the country could do these things, should we consider other factors? So, because of the fact that he was standing for a lot of those ideas, that some people said maybe there's a reality check coming, that also contributed beyond just the purely personal. But you're right. Overwhelmingly, this is you either love Venizelos or you think he's the
Senghalese
devil.
goat.
Yeah,
That's what they called him as well as Senghalese
yeah,
goat. I guess there's some racist reference to
yeah.
Crete being close to Africa, and you know, that's wow. Yeah, it always gets me, and you're completely right. Like, okay, history is driven so much by geography and economics and whatnot, but also driven by personalities and the clash of personalities and people play such a huge role. Of course, they're the
Mhm,
leaders, they're in charge. If they
mhm.
don't get along, whatever the case. Um, anyways, that's so interesting. Um, so everyone's trying at this point. Greece is getting chopped up. I don't know, like your favorite Greek dessert. Baklava you eat usually in little pieces, so you don't
Right,
really chop baklava, but you get my point.
right,
Greece is getting chopped up, parceled out. It's under pressure from the Entente. It's under pressure from the Central Powers. I mean, from the Central Powers, physical, military pressure. Um, let's get into like closer to when things actually culminate in the violence to what's called the Battle of Athens, which what I'm alluding to is, I mean, this is like the super nutshell version, but the Dante forces land, I don't know, like 2 or 3 thousand contingency of forces in Athens or maybe Piraeus, and they march all the way to Athens to pretty much do what? Try to like formally get the king to abdicate, or what's the goals of this operation? What is the operation? What does it kind of look like?
right. So essentially, what happens is this negotiation gets more intense from the Entente perspective, that kind of tightening the screws. The Greek government in the waning days here before the Battle of Athens uh, starts to sort of go along with what the Entente is proposing to them or essentially demanding at this point. And of course, the famous example of that is that the royalist government actually does propose demobilizing the Greek military, which was an Entente request,
Oh, wow.
so as to not allow this force then to be co opted by the Central Powers. Um,
So is that strictly just because the Entente is not strictly, but is that because the Entente is worried that Greece is a threat, a thorn on it, like an actual military threat at this point? Like it's making them nervous as
well,
well?
right. Well, they just don't want, at this point in 1916, we have to remember the context of the war, that the Central Powers is doing, as a whole, is running a pretty successful war effort by this point. We tend to have this impression of the First World War as this stalemate, that no one seems to be winning, that it's just a lot of bloodletting for no reason. We think of the Western Front, the fighting for territory and gaining nothing uh, over a long period of time. But we have to put ourselves in the shoes of people in that moment, whether decision makers in government, military officials, the public reading the newspapers, especially in neutral countries as well. They don't see the war right now as a total stalemate. They actually see the Central Powers doing pretty well. And so it's not really so much of what Greece can offer the Central Powers to be kind of like the equivalent of what the US would end up being for the Entente from 1917, 1918, but just the idea of we can ill afford to have another country join the Central Powers. The Entente military campaigns are not going so well. They're holding their own in many sectors, but not really yet making much headway against any of the Central Powers forces. We're getting the situation in Russia. Instability is coming, right? It's not quite there yet, but Russia's not doing well either. There's really just a sense of doom and gloom on the Entente side, and outside observers too, who might have been sympathetic to that cause. And so Greece then would be a little feather in the cap, so to speak, for the Central Powers. Another little country that wants to join the Central Powers or is forced to, whatever the case might be, the end result would be the same, that Greece could then contribute uh, and at least cause another situation where the Entente has to defend itself or to respond in some way. And so this is why the demobilization uh, threat really comes in, saying you have to do this now, or we're going to bring in pressure to force you to do this.
So that's what they do. They bring in pressure, force
Right.
lands. What does the force consist of? It's not just French and British, is it?
Correct. It's largely a British and French, and then a smaller Italian contingent that is participating as well. And what it essentially is, I think to Entente planners, they saw this very much in the sense of what European powers like Britain had done to Greece in the past, which is kind of version of gunboat diplomacy, where you bring your navy to bear on the weaker power and make them concede, make them give in to what you want to do. Now, in this case, they go a step further. They actually land troops and prepare to make a demonstration to show the royalist government that they're serious about this. They want actions taken now, and they want to know Greece's intentions to declare itself. Which side now are you supporting? Because now this decision is not really yours to make anymore. This the situation now calls for a decision, and so this is sort of where we are in that early December period. And the Entente is coming at this from a situation of confidence as well. The French admiral that's in command is seen as a rather popular figure. He actually played a role in saving Armenian refugees the previous year. So
Oh, wow.
he was actually a pretty popular figure internationally, seen as this humanitarian. and a capable voice who also wasn't really looking to do any damage to Greece. He was kind of still seeking to be reconciliatory in this moment, conciliatory in this moment with the king, and saying, let's come to an agreement about this. But of course, very soon the situation makes it so that that's not really possible without a fight.
So what does so this is I mean this is really what is called the Battle of Athens, right? Not to be confused. I mean there's many battles of Athens. I mean, when we get into the Civil War, we're going to see
Right,
another one,
right.
obviously. But this Battle of Athens, I mean, so is it literally it is like a mini battle. I mean, there's and it's a big mistake I made when I fell kind of into the blip trap where it's just a little blip in like Greek history in my primer series. And part of me did that on purpose because I realized, but also the literature does just kind of overlook this entire clash. It's framed as there's a small clash, they're just all small skirmish, and then so and so happens and the king abdicates after, and that's it. But there is there's military dimensions to this, correct?
Right, right. So I mean, essentially to set the stage, right? So we've introduced now the Entente side of this, that there is a naval presence in Faliro Bay, I believe, and this military presence. A lot of a lot of Marines from these countries on the Entente side, and some regular troops, but they're professional, seasoned forces. I mean, it's not like they're inexperienced by any means. And then we have on the royalist side, of course, some regular Greek forces, but largely the combatants that take place in or that take part in this battle are reservists, essentially a kind of militia that's called out to defend the city, largely organized by Metaxa. This was his sort of strategy and response to this aggression, to this idea that now there's an invading force on Greek territory. How are we going to respond to this? We have to have some kind of defense of the city. And so this now sort of sets up the two sides. And you're right, they do engage. I mean, there is fighting. There's a bombardment of the city, even the royal palace. So today's parliament is struck by a shell. I think it damages the kitchen, the
Wow.
royal kitchen there. So they do some damage. Not extensive damage to the city, but they are attacking. And we have to remind ourselves what's going on here. This is a World War One battle, right? But it's a World War One battle being fought by only one of the camps of the two opposing sides. It's the Entente against a neutral state, uh, fighting on the streets of that neutral power's capital. And of course, therefore there is some damage. And if you're familiar with Athens, of course, too, it's rather interesting to walk around the city today and kind of imagine what was going on in 1916 there. A lot of the fighting took place around the hills leading up to the Acropolis. Obviously, either side seeking to gain strategic advantage, take the high ground in the city wherever possible. But the bulk of the fighting, or maybe the most interesting event in the Battle of Athens, took place around the Zapion. So the famous exhibition hall, the famous neoclassical building in the center of Athens, where that hosted the 1896 Olympic events and continues to be this sort of main building in the city. The Entente forces, or a good portion of the Entente forces, are driven into the building because they're being shelled. So they're actually being attacked here. They take this as their defensive position. They're kind of stuck. They really can't necessarily retreat, and so that begins a negotiation with the government to say, okay, now what are we going to do here? We've been fighting. There's kind of a stalemate in the lull in the fighting. This force is trapped. Some other Entente forces have actually been forced to surrender
Wow.
to these Greek forces that
Sounds like a
were,
fiasco so
yeah,
far.
yeah. And we have to again remind ourselves that these are not necessarily all professional, experienced Greek troops fighting even against this force. So it makes it even more of a confusing and really remarkable situation and disheartening for the Entente. So eventually there is a negotiation. The shelling stops from the naval ships, and the remaining Entente forces in the city are allowed to retreat back to this, and their wounded are cared for, or the most severely wounded are cared for in Greek hospitals. But that sort of ends this really brief but chaotic fight in Athens in early December of 1916.
Wow. I mean, it is, and again, I mean, like, totally, I think, again, my first primer, I think I framed it as, you know, the Tante applies pressure. I mentioned Metaxas, and Metaxas is pretty much whispering in the king's ear, the queen, to go down and fight in Peloponnesos. I think he had his own, either that was the militia he had assembled, but you don't hear. I mean, you don't hear that. It sounds like an Entente loss, essentially.
And that's how it was presented at the time. I think importantly in the media of the day, and to go back to our point about how people felt across the world in 1916 about the sort of course of the war and the direction of the war. A lot of people felt like this was a huge embarrassment for the Entente, and even a sort of resignation to the fact that Greece was going to join Germany, and this was going to be another embarrassment for the Entente. How were they going to crawl out of this issue? And what would happen in the war at this point? So that might surprise us a lot, given what we know about the history of World War One and what happens not long after, really, this event. That, of course, we know Germany doesn't come close to winning this conflict, and in fact, it's the exact opposite. But it's important to note at the time that people are feeling this way, and they're really disheartened, and that's what makes this event, I think, all the more surprising. That how do we get a situation where there is this sense of dread, and this is an embarrassment and it's a defeat, and how are we going to respond to this? To all of a sudden Greece being on the Entente's side
Right.
a few
It is
months
quite a
later.
swing of,
Right.
events. That is. Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think about that either. I mean, going from literally fighting, killing Entente forces in Athens to just quite shortly after joining the Entente and, joining, Britain and France in a lot of other events. I mean, in 1919, there'll be Greek troops in Crimea
Right.
fighting on the side of the whites
Right.
with,
Right.
other international forces and so on and so on. So it is, wow, wow, wow. So the Battle of Athens happens. Obviously, it's a fiasco. This does not happen. It does not work. Their main objective doesn't work. But eventually, the king, there is a change of forces, as we know. Venizelos does take over after Noemvriana. How does that happen? What is the final thing that occurs that allows Venizelos to take over all of Greece?
Right. Well, I think there's a few things at play here that we have to talk about. On the one hand, this immediate aftermath gets very messy too. So we have a situation where people now are really amped up, and that sort of polarization between royalists and Venizelos kicks off in descends into violence in this immediate aftermath of the battle. So it's not an event which in and of itself then presents like a unified front for the country. It's not seen as a hostile invasion by a big portion of the population, and in fact, that fueled rumors that are still unfounded. We really don't know uh, how many, if any, people really who were Greek helped the Entente or actually took up arms and fought other Greeks. Though we generally assumed that that was the case, or at the very least, of course, that the Entente was being guided in some way by some sympathetic Greek people. But we don't really have a lot of concrete knowledge about whether or not this was a kind of mini civil war being fought out on the streets of Athens. But certainly the aftermath of that plays out that way. And that increasingly weakens the country. I mean, we have to remember this is a divided country as it is, and it's being occupied by the militaries of the two opposing sides at this point.
You're referring to like political violence that takes place after the Battle of Athens
Right,
between Venizelos and monarchists, essentially, correct?
right. And so it's interesting too that one of the groups that ends up being targeted the most in this violence on the streets of Athens, especially after the battle, happened to be Anatolian refugees. So those people who actually fled the Ottoman Empire during the war because they felt as if they could be numbered as an enemy internally.
This
Uh,
early, because
yes,
I when you talk about this, we always talk, like, it's always framed, not always framed, but the research I've done, it's always like the Anatolian refugees, the refugees are always very discriminated against post Asia Minor campaign because whatever, for whatever reason, right? People are racist. They're a reminder of the failed expedition. Greece is broke and poor, and refugees, whether your own people or not, are generally throughout history not treated well. But it is interesting that even so early, the refugees are associated with Venizelos.
yep.
They're clung together, ideal, like politically speaking. That's interesting.
Yes, that they're not the only people targeted in that moment, but they are definitely singled out by the royalist sympathizers as being part of the problem. That this was a sort of enemy force, basically a foreign actor that was going to help drive Greece into the arms of the Entente and get involved in this reckless conflict as people were seeing it. And so this group was targeted. Now
That's
to get into more of like what actually happens too, right? It all goes back to the very question that we were talking about at the very beginning, that why would Greece not be able to get into the war on the side of the Central Powers? Because they're too vulnerable to the naval pressure of the Entente. And so the increasing naval pressure of the Entente is what ultimately makes the situation untenable. That even though you could win this little battle, or essentially win this little battle by forcing the Entente troops to go back to their ships, but you're not going to be able to outlast an Entente blockade. If we're really talking about, okay, you're going to be a hostile player, we're going to just impose a blockade. How are you going to survive? We know that the Central Powers are not able to supply their own home fronts, and by this point, it's getting really dire in most of those home fronts of whether we're talking Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Bulgaria. Situation's bad. So if Greece is locked into this, whether they like it or not, how can the country really survive? There really isn't an answer to that. They would not be able to last without some kind of actor um,
right.
supporting them.
Right.
So
And traditionally, Greece has imported a lot,
yeah,
let's just say. I
so
mean,
the odds were always then stacked against a decision at that point. It was a matter of basically seeing if they could outlast the politics in the Entente side from the royalist standpoint. I mean, that could they somehow do enough to convince them to go home? But they were not going to go home. They were not going to forget what the situation was. And they certainly were not going to trust the royalist government now. So even though there was this sense, and I think it's important to bring up that the king and his advisors were talking to the British and French, and I think there was good faith negotiations. I think it was an extremely difficult position to be in, not something that anyone would really want to be faced with. And so, despite that, I think we can also appreciate the standpoint of the British and French that if you already like the guy that's up in Thessaloniki a lot, are you really going to give an audience to the person that just killed some of your troops? And
this
even if
makes
they're
sense.
right, even if they are claiming that they still want to work, they're not trying to be hostile towards you. There was just a sense that we can't trust the royalist government and those people sympathetic to them.
Right, and especially when you consider that it's not like Metaxas was a low level
Right.
junior officer or something. I mean, I believe he was chief of general staff or whatever in the military. He was very high up there. I mean, he was right, the king's right hand man or very close confidant to the
Hmm.
king. We know he gets exiled after this
Hmm.
with the
Right.
monarchists.
Right.
And he was leading the charge
Right.
of killing the Entente forces and
Right.
fighting in Athens. So yeah, I mean that does make sense from the Entente standpoint. So I mean, so at this point, what do? They just cut off all communication with the king and the monarchists and the government in Athens in general.
They give an ultimatum too. I mean, this is kind of the final ultimatum that you need to leave at this point. That the only situation in which the Entente is going to be satisfied is not just to demobilized. They're not interested anymore in demobilization. They're not interested anymore in. They're a long way away from accepting just like not having certain kinds of artillery and other kinds of weapons. Now we don't trust that you're going to act in good faith anymore. You're done. Now we're going to decide, and we're going to bring in our ally. Venizelos has already basically been seen as an ally of the Entente, and of course, kind of leading back to what we were talking about before, he is constantly also not just listening to the carrots that the Entente had provided earlier in the war. He's suggesting these things too. I mean, he's also saying, I can do things. We have to kind of remember that even when Venizelos was prime minister and was, certainly fighting with the king, but still in power there, he's also suggesting, I think I can swing this. I can help you. So they knew we have a friend there.
Yeah, and like a good example of that, if I'm not mistaken, anyways, is him offering. I mean, he was offering to send soldiers to the Dardanelles campaign,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
And
I'm pretty sure.
yeah, to
Yeah,
participate and yeah, to participate in any way that the Entente saw as feasible. Uh,
really willing ally,
yeah,
extremely willing ally, from what I've read. Very, very
yeah,
willing.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So the situation then became, you know, it was coming to a head, and the decision was pretty clear from the Entente side that we're just going to have to put enough pressure to bear to just make the king realize he doesn't have enough friends. This isn't. He's not going to expect a huge military diversion in his favor, any kind of supplies coming in his favor in any way. The Central
Yeah, why
Powers are
would we
cash
have
strapped.
the king when we can have Venizelos
Right,
almost?
right. Uh,
Like, so how do they get Venizelos like actually? They give him an ultimatum. Does after a while he just abdicates in general, and then Venizelos takes over in a nutshell?
and then, yeah, I mean, and then we kind of get into again, to switch back between the external side of things and the internal, like the Greek political situation. This is actually a pretty important moment in Greek political history, which I feel like could also be maybe a topic of conversation in and of itself. This kind of now shift in the governments and just kind of like the legislative structure of the country. And Venizelos was a master of playing to whatever the political, not just political situation, but the actual like composition of the government, whatever was permitted by law or gray areas that could be exploited. Venizelos certainly knew how to do this. And so, again, we see a situation where uh, Greek the Greek political system is actually going to change in this moment, and Venizelos benefits from that and uses or harnesses that change to effectively create a government that then would be supportive of the Entente and run the war effort. Um, and so this is another chapter in Greek political history where the situation changes, the composition of government changes, the structure of the government changes, and would change again in just a few years. And so, this, to kind of summarize it neatly, Venizelos takes advantage of the chaos that had been created before in 1915, 1916. He harnesses that change to bring about the favorable political change, to give himself what was really the most clear mandate from a legislative standpoint that a Greek politician really had. Of course, the royalist side would say, well, it wasn't legitimate because we really couldn't effectively oppose Venizelos anymore anyway. And he certainly wasn't interested in bringing in opposing voices, even non royalist sympathizers, say minority communities in the country. He wasn't really interested in getting their backing
Hmm.
either. And so, how this wasn't a truly national mandate, but it gave that little boost to the Venizelos supporters to effectively have that control of the government, um, and run the country for that time.
Who takes over after? So the king is out, and you're referring to in Parliament, if I'm not
Yes.
mistaken, correct? So the king gets out. He's resigns. He abdicates. The Entente forces they force what was it, his son to take it over in his
Well, so right.
Alexander.
So Alexander becomes the king. He's young. He's seen by Venizelos and by the government that now Venizelos has created as a really uh, favorable or beneficial tool of this government. That he's effective. I mean, a lot of scholars say, King Alexander was essentially a prisoner of the palace.
Oh
To
my gosh!
he did not really get to command any kind of influence that many other Greek monarchs would have in terms of the parliamentary system. He is basically subservient to Venizelos and to the needs of the Venizelos government.
Is it true that I mean, just from what I read or whatever, that he wasn't? It's not like he wasn't. Is it more that he was a prisoner, or he wasn't also as interested in ruling in general? He almost comes off as like a young guy that likes fast cars and stuff like that. Kind of is that kind of not the most accurate take, or it's more complicated than that,
I
obviously.
mean, yeah, I mean, I feel like there's definitely a degree of how prepared, at the very least, he was to take on this kind of responsibility, and that same charge could be leveled at other monarchs, and of course, not just in Greece, but we think of in modern Greek history, especially the last king, Constantine II, being in a very similar situation in his youth. That this is sort of thrust upon him. There's a political crisis. Does he really have the wherewithal and the political capital to be a player in this story? And the answer, of course, at that time was no. And the same is likely true with Alexander as well. That even if he had really wanted to, if he was so committed to sort of avenge his father and his older brother as victims of this kind of political uh, uh, conflict, and if he wanted to actually make those changes, could he have enough friends? I don't really think so. I mean, we were talking about people being exiled, right? I mean, the crowd around is getting smaller. He's basically being surrounded
Boy,
by people who are loyal to Venizelos too. And so they wouldn't have really done anything to damage their relationship with Venizelos by potentially backing some kind of opposition to him
right.
from within. And certainly at this point, there's momentum, right? Now people are starting to see, from Venizelos' standpoints, the sky is clearing up. The royalists are out of the picture, really, but we still get to like keep our system. We
Hmm.
have a monarch still, so they can't say we've done anything too radical there. So this is seen as kind of the momentum and the deserved momentum now that the Entente took that action to back Venizelos, and that it was very clear they weren't going anywhere. That the front in Macedonia was only growing, and this was sort of a situation that was here to stay.
Wow. It's amazing like this series. I mean, it's a chaotic series of events, but in the end it settles down to this more like stable situation where you have, a singular government in charge, Venizelos. The northern front seems to be more stabilized. You know what I mean? And there's other external things I feel like. I mean, I don't know, do you think for example, the Ottomans joining the side of the Central Powers, did that also kind of help rally Venizelos's point? Because it's almost more of an aligning of stars. Even you have your arch enemy on the Central Powers, and
Well, you have basically Greece's two most
oh, Bulgaria,
host,
right?
and I
That's
mean,
right.
arguably
Yeah.
and arguably the bigger enemy in the first half of the 20th century
Hmm.
in Bulgaria, the more consistent enemy. And so, again, to go back to that point of what would Greece even gain by joining the war? Well, the answer is quite clear that if those two are on their side, okay,
Right.
we might be able to come to some sort of agreement with them and fight alongside them. Of course, Greece wasn't an enemy of the Ottoman Empire in the Second Balkan War, for example. Not necessarily too thrilled at what they were trying to do, but not directly opposed to it either. They had a mutual enemy in common at that point, and that would be kind of a continued point in Greco-Turkish relations as well going forward. That so long as perhaps there was a mutual enemy too, some of the disputes or rivalry and the history certainly that existed could be sort of maintained or kind of put down in the favor of whatever the interests were at the time. And so I think that would be a situation to look at in this story too, from that First World War
Yeah.
perspective. That they're on that side. So you have to decide: we're either going to be friendly with all of them, and come what may, we'll get something out of this, or there's more to be gained by being on the side of their enemies. And if the enemies aren't that interested, maybe in taking all of this territory, they say, sure, yeah, Greece can get this, and this makes sense to be part of Greece. That works. So we find ourselves in that situation, really.
Right. Well, we're going about a little over an hour here, and I think we actually got through really everything that, I mean, I believe so, with the Noemvriana. This has been a great chat. I really seriously love this, and I think this has been so informative too for like the listeners as well, because there's just so much more. Like I always told the listeners, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, but every once in a while I want to bring out a bona fide expert, you know, PhD, Dr. Dale Pappas, as you guys can hear, very knowledgeable on this topic. We'll have him on again. Uh, I don't think this will be the last time that we meet, right? Right, Doc?
I
Dr.
appreciate that. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me again, and look forward to it.
Yeah, yeah. Take care, right?